Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating, high-stakes judicial battle that strikes right at the core of how a society governs its public officials. We're going to examine a definitive, game-changing ruling from the Supreme Court of the Philippines, the case of People versus Palabrica III. You see, this case asks a huge question. What actually happens when aggressive anti-corruption efforts collide head-on with the sacred, constitutionally enshrined presumption of innocence? Like, when does a routine signature suddenly become a crime, and when is it literally just a mayor doing his job? We're going to break down the anatomy of a verdict that completely reshaped the legal landscape for local executives. I want to kick things off with this incredibly powerful quote from Justice Garland, who actually penned the Supreme Court decision we're analyzing today. He wrote, "Efforts to combat graft and corruption, no matter how well-intended and laudable, must not be at the expense of the constitutionally enshrined right of presumption of innocence. The end does not justify the means." This statement is the absolute anchor for everything we're about to discuss. It sets a profound boundary, right? Fighting corruption is vital, obviously, but the mechanics of justice, the strict adherence to the law and the rights of the accused, can never be sacrificed just to get a conviction. Okay, let's dive into this. We're breaking down the Supreme Court's appellate review step by step. First, a mayor on trial. Second, the anti-graft checklist. Third, charge 1 on the lease. Fourth, charge 2 on the permit. And lastly, the final precedent. Section 1. A mayor on trial, the case of Rufino Pablo Palabrica III. So let's meet the central figure in our explainer, Rufino Pablo Palabrica III, the municipal mayor of Dingle, Iloilo. Now, besides being mayor, Palabrica is also a licensed physician. He wholly owns and operates a local medical clinic and a pharmacy called Farmacia Francisca. He ended up getting charged with 2 counts of violating the country's notoriously strict Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act. To really wrap our heads around this case, we have to trace its chronological journey. Palabrica's clinic and pharmacy had been occupying leased market stalls in the Dingle public market since way back in 1996, long before he was ever elected mayor. Fast forward to January 2014. Now acting as mayor, he signed a renewal for that exact same lease contract, and he also granted a business permit to his own pharmacy. By 2016, a complaint was filed, and the ombudsman charged him with graft. In July 2019, the Sandigan Bayan, the special court that handles corruption cases, convicted him. But then, in a monumental shift in November 2021, the Supreme Court completely reversed that decision. Let's find out exactly how that happened. Moving to Section 2, the Anti-Graft Checklist, deconstructing Section 3H of RA No. 3019. To understand how a conviction gets overturned, we've got to look at the specific anti-graft law at the heart of the guilty verdict. The Supreme Court doesn't just look at the general vibe of a case, They use a highly specific legal checklist. For a conviction to hold under Section 3H, the prosecution must successfully check off all 3 of these specific elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Element 1. The accused is a public officer. Element 2. The officer has a direct or indirect financial interest in a business, contract, or transaction. And Element 3. The officer intervenes or takes part in their official capacity. It's like a 3-legged stool. If even one of these elements is missing, the crime simply hasn't been committed, period. Before we systematically break down how the Supreme Court reviewed that checklist, we really need to acknowledge the immense stakes here. The Sandigan Bayan's initial verdict was absolutely devastating. They found Mayor Palabrica guilty, sentencing him to a minimum of 6 years and 1 month to a maximum of 8 years in prison. And guys, that is per count. On top of that, perpetual disqualification from holding any public office. His entire career, his freedom, his reputation, all of it was on the line as this went up to the Supreme Court. Section 3. Charge 1. The lease. Investigating actual intervention. Let's focus on the first charge regarding the January 7, 2014 lease contract. The prosecution argued that the mayor criminally entered into a contract by signing for the lessor, the municipality, while simultaneously signing as the lessee for his own pharmacy. So the first 2 elements of our checklist were clearly met, right? He was a public officer, and obviously he had a financial interest in his own pharmacy's lease. But the Supreme Court zeroed in on this absolutely critical question regarding that third element. Did the mayor actually intervene? Does simply putting a pen to paper and signing a document inherently prove corrupt intervention and an abuse of power? Well, the Supreme Court basically said no way. They found that Mayor Palabrica only signed the contract because he was explicitly authorized to do so by the local council through Resolution No. 2012-32. The law literally requires the mayor to sign contracts on behalf of the municipality. The court pointed out that this lease was just a renewal of an arrangement that had been sitting there since 1996.
He went through the regular procedure, paid the standard fees, got no special treatment. So, because the prosecution completely failed to prove he used his influence to actually push the lease through, that third checklist element, actual intervention, was missing. Charge 1 fails.
Section 4, Charge 2, the permit, decoding legal linguistics. Now we're unpacking the fascinating legal linguistics surrounding the mayor issuing a business permit to his own pharmacy. I know there's a definite irony in a mayor officially rubber stamping his own pharmacy's permit, but does that irony make it illegal? To decide this, the Supreme Court invoked this brilliantly classic Latin maxim, nostitur associus. I know, it sounds super intimidating, but it just means the meaning of an unclear word is determined by the words surrounding it. Basically, judging a word by the company it keeps. It's kind of wild to think that an ancient phrase from a dead language is exactly what stood between a modern mayor and an 8-year prison sentence. Let's look at the exact text of the law. Section 3H prohibits a financial interest in any business, contract, or transaction. The prosecution argued issuing a permit is a transaction, but the Supreme Court applied our Latin maxim. Look at how the word transaction sits right next to business and contract. Because of that positioning, it must logically share their core commercial characteristics. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast it highlights. A commercial business or contract essentially involves a binding agreement and, crucially, a monetary exchange or profit. But a business permit, the court pointed out that a permit isn't a commercial agreement at all. It's a regulatory exercise of delegated police power. There is literally no monetary consideration happening between the government and the permittee. And here is the decisive blow to count 2. Because a permit is purely regulatory and lacks any monetary exchange, the Supreme Court ruled that a business permit is emphatically not a transaction under Section 3H. Since it's not a transaction, the mayor couldn't possibly have a corrupt financial interest in it under the specific law. That means the second checklist element was entirely missing. Boom! Charge 2 also fails. Section 5, the final precedent, the balance of justice. So, with the core elements missing in both charges, the Supreme Court completely acquitted Mayor Palabrica. But let's zoom out. So the crucial point is captured in this foundational doctrine. Penal laws are strictly construed against the state and liberally in favor of the accused. When a law is ambiguous, like the word transaction, the government just can't stretch its definition to score a conviction. This doctrine is absolutely crucial. It protects citizens from overly broad, stretched interpretations of criminal laws by the state. Which brings us to the end of our explainer. This case leaves us with a profound reminder. Yes, the fight against graft is essential, but it can't be a bulldozer that levels our constitutional rights. It really forces us to ask, when prosecuting corruption, how do we ensure the scales of justice never tip too far away from the presumption of innocence? It's a remarkably delicate balance that the Supreme Court must maintain. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Let that question linger next time you think about how our laws are written, and more importantly, how they are applied in the real world.